Welcome to part D of the video set on TIAs, where we're talking about site traffic volumes. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how much traffic our new site development is going to generate. So we're looking at how to undertake site traffic generation in this video. So first of all, one of the easy ways of doing it is to base your trip generation on published rates. The RTA has a guide for traffic generation development. There's the Guide to Traffic Management has some information in it as well, and the ITE Green Book or Brown Book sometimes, depending on the edition, has a huge amount of data in it from various studies, and you can go in there and you can look up rates, and that'll give you an idea as to how many trips will be generated by a residential development or a condo development, all based on some sort of survey that's been done and has been sort of accepted as an established rate in the industry. The ITE guide in particular is mostly based on traffic surveys from suburban US. So you sometimes question as to how relevant this data is to your particular site, because it's often been done in the context of a very, very low transit mode share. And so if you're in downtown Melbourne, downtown Toronto, downtown KL, downtown anywhere, you're unlikely to see as much traffic generated by a development because more people will be on transit or walking. Another way of doing it is to use some sort of travel survey data or some sort of first principles approach. So here's an example from Toronto again, just because I'm familiar with it. The Transportation Tomorrow survey, they do a survey every 5 years and they ring people up and they ask them, well, how often did you leave the house today? Where did you go? What time did you leave, etc., etc. And so they get an idea as to how many people travel on a typical day, where do they go, all that sort of stuff. And so from that data, you can start making some sort of estimates. So this data set is quite local. It might have, study areas that are only a kilometre or so big. And so you can make some assumptions. Well, there'll be 95% of the people will be in the building at any time, 1.5 people per unit. So now we sort of know, how many people are going to be travelling in any day. 80% of people travelling in the weekday periods. Again, some of these are rules of thumb, some of these are estimates, some of these are based on data, but essentially you're trying to get a reasonable estimate of what the trip generation is going to be like. And here you go, you can see this in this particular report, which is not the same report as the Bathurst one. There's all the maths has been done in a table so that you get an idea as to how many people are driving, how many people are taking transit, etc., etc. That'll be based on the survey information. And here we go, further on down, and it finally works out to being, in the peak hour, there will be 40 trips by cars, and there will be 45 trips by transit, which are generated by this particular development. And so, yeah, that's one way of doing it. The next way is to actually go out and measure things. So if you're going to be building a new residential building in the middle of downtown Toronto, well, maybe you can go out and sit outside some residential buildings which are already built that are in the downtown Toronto and actually watch how many trips they generate via vehicles. So here we go, we've got a whole load of traffic surveys have been done outside these various places, and in the AM peak hour they generated 0.17 vehicle trips per unit. This one here, 0.10 vehicle trips per unit. And so you get an average, and that gives you an idea. And so for our building with 306 units in this case, we're estimating it's going to be about 30 trips in the peak hour. Which is quite low because we are talking about streets in downtown Toronto where most people walk. But if you're out in suburban areas, you might be able to use those ITE rates and be a bit more comfortable in them, whereas there'd obviously be a massive overestimate of the amount of traffic generated in downtown Toronto. Here we go, another similar approach, only this time the rate is not based on number of units because we're talking about a a shopping centre development. So this time it's the trips per occupied parking space. And then we also have trips per 100 square metres of retail floor area. So again, very similar approach. Go out there, look at Portland and Queen. You'd have some data about how big it is. You also were out there counting how many spaces were occupied at the peak period. And then you watch how many people drive in and out of the driveway, and that gives you a rate per space or a rate per square metre of developed floor area. And so you basically just take all these numbers and plug them into a table, and out come the number of trips your development is going to generate, or an estimate thereof. So our development in this particular case, I think this is the Bathurst one again, we've got almost 1,200 gross floor area metres squared. A note on that, there are a lot of different ways of measuring floor area. GFA is often used, which is sort of, I think, the gross floor area, but not including the hallways or certain types of service areas. It's often sort of used as a sort of a generic term, but you can look it up online, all the various different GFAs, NFAs, various FAs. It all stands for floor area. The one I'm often used to seeing as well is net floor area, which I think is something to do with the leasable area, or maybe it's leasable floor area. Fundamentally, it's very confusing sometimes, and depending on who your architect is and which jurisdiction you're in, there will be different ways of measuring these things. GFA is a fairly generic one, which is gross floor area, basically how big is the building. But you want to be careful to make sure that you are using the same floor area as someone else, and you aren't, overestimating or underestimating by using a slightly different way of measuring area. Just something to be careful of. Anyway, so we've tossed the gross floor area into our estimates. Looks like in this one here, there's been a rate per parking space, and the traffic generation has been done per, there we go, the notes, traffic generation rate per demanded parking space. So it's 0.35 trips inbound based on for every occupied space at the peak time. So that ends up being about 50 trips inbound, and then you add it all together. And then do the same thing for the afternoon peak hour and the Saturday peak hour, and you end up with, some numbers. Take note of the pass-by trips. We will be touching on that in a later video, but it's just something to take note of. There is a difference between pass-by trips and primary trips, and those two add up to be your total trips. But stay tuned for the next video on pass-by trips.